Hello, dear friends. This evening is Yom Hazikaron, which is the Soldiers' Memorial Day here in Israel. And I'd just like to share a few thoughts in anticipation of Yom Hazikaron. On this day, it starts with a siren. As Israelis who have been here for many years, we know that there are two sirens in the state of Israel. There is the war siren, which goes up and down, and then there is the peace siren, which is a steady tone. Here in Jerusalem, every Friday before the Sabbath comes in, we have what's called the peace siren, which is announcing the fact that the Sabbath is coming in near. Other places in Israel have it in certain places too. And we have this on Yom HaShoah, on Holocaust Day, memorial, which was last week at 10 o'clock in the morning. And we also have it on Yom Hazikaron at 8 o'clock in the evening and 11 o'clock in the morning, a little bit later, to allow, in normal years, families to participate at the memorial ceremony at Mount Herzl, which is the soldiers and others burial site here in cemetery here in Jerusalem. Aside from at night, there is a ceremony at the Kotel. So, as I said, I'd like to offer a few ideas about Yom Hazikaron. My uncle, B.J. Feinstone, was an officer in the Canadian Army. Serving in World War II, he was injured. And after the war, he saw it his duty to always be there on Memorial Day, to participate year after year. And in his later years, he also felt it was important to talk and to speak about what he remembered. Because as he said to me one time, a few years before he passed away, he said, I don't know if I'm the only one left who remembers fighting in the Second World War for the Canadian Army, but I think I'm the only one who can still stand and talk about these things at my age. I had another uncle on my mother's side, Marvin Moshe Socket, who at the age of 18 served in the American Army in Germany just after the war. Of course, it was a different scenario then. It was peacetime, trying to rebuild a broken Europe which had been devastated by the war. Marvin spent his whole life as a man of peace. The thought of war bothered him for the rest of his life, and he really pursued peace between people, even created programs trying to create peace between countries in the ways that he understood it. Well, when I came to live in Israel, of course, like all other Israelis, I had to go in the army. And I remember one time, I actually went in the army in my late 20s, and I served for a year. And during that, I was called a lone soldier, Chayal Baded. And lone soldiers are allowed off time to visit their parents. So I went, my parents were in Montreal at the time, and on the way, a friend of mine said, you know what? It's a Sukkot holiday. Come spend with me 2 days in Long Beach, Long Island. There's a program. We'll talk, we'll meet people. I said, okay. So we went to this program, and we're sitting around a table. It's a Friday night, and you have all these young, upwardly mobile, what we call, American Jews from New York City sitting around the table, and they introduced each other. This was an accountant, that one's a lawyer, that one's a doctor, and the women, of course, are also doctors, lawyers, accountants, because that's what Jews do in the United States. And then it comes to me, and they said, what do you do? I said, I'm in the army. They all laughed. I didn't understand at the beginning. I said, I'm in the Israeli army. They said, oh, that they understood. Because for them, an American Jew in the army, they thought it was like for them an anomaly. They thought at first it was a joke. And I remember thinking after that, sitting around the table about this idea and saying to myself that there seems to be what I would consider an imbalance in the share of responsibility for the future of the Jewish people. That's what I was thinking at the time. So, what is the Israeli army? Well, I guess I could explain it by two stories. Story number one takes place 1945, and the Americans come into Germany and free camps there, like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau. So General Patton and Eisenhower decide that all the officers of the American army have to see what the Germans did, of course, to justify the position of the Allies in the war. And at the time, there is an American officer, a general by the name of David Marcus, Mickey Marcus, excuse me, Michael Marcus was his name at the time. Mickey Marcus was born in Romania. A Jewish man, he moved to the United States as a child with his parents, fought in the First World War, and he was a general in the Second World War, working with LaGuardia in Washington at the time. And he also wanted to see in his own eyes what had happened to the Jews in Europe. And he found the devastation, the camps, so shocking that he wanted to do something to help the fledgling new Israeli state that had just started. And Ben-Gurion found out about this, and he called him up. And he said, Mickey, you got to help us. We don't know how to put together an army. We need your experience. And he decided to do that, to come to Israel in 1947, to help Ben-Gurion establish the army. And when the Americans found out, they said, you're a general in the American army. You can't just go to another country, and even if they're an ally. So I said to him, change your name. And he did, and he changed his name to David Stone, and then they allowed him to go to Israel. If you want, you can watch, there's a famous movie called Cast the Giant Shadow about the story of Mickey Marcus. In other words, when we talk about the Israeli army and the state of Israel, yes, we're always talking about something in the shadow of the Shoah, but that's only part of the story. You know, they say when Ben-Gurion, in November of 1947, the UN partition plan granted Israel a state within smaller borders. But Ben-Gurion did not declare a country at the time because the British mandate was taking place at the time. So he wanted to wait for the British to leave, which was the 15th of May, 1948. And in the meantime, he got two calls. One of them was from King Abdallah, who called Golda Meir and told her, you know, if you guys decide to declare a state, we see that as declaration of war and you will have a few Arab armies on your head. And the second call he got was in April from Harry Truman. And Truman said to him, you know, we want to help you, but if you declare a state, we don't know if you're going to survive it because there are going to be 7 armies that will probably attack you. Truman, of course, when Ben-Gurion did declare, the United States was the first to recognize, but he warned him that it could be dangerous. And what with Ben Gurion? It's a very interesting story, and I want to say it just in a brief way. On the 12th of May, 1948, Ben Gurion puts together his, of course, shadow cabinet, you might say, at the time. One of them is in the United States. Two of them are stuck in Jerusalem. There is a siege at the time. And so there are only 9 people out of his 13 cabinet. So one of them he brings in with a little Piper plane from Jerusalem. They are now 10. And 5 of them are against. They say, David, this is not a good idea because we know that the Arabs are going to attack us, and you explained that to us, and we're not sure we're ready. We're not sure that the army is ready to stand up such an attack. How many do we have? 30,000. How many do they have? 110, 120,000. How are we going to do it? We don't have planes. We don't have. Well, Ben Gurion finally turned to Yigal Yadin, who at that time was in charge of Yigal alone, in charge of army intelligence. Says, Yigal, what do you think? You've been studying the situation. What are our chances? Alon says, tell you the truth, David, not more than 50-50. Ben Gurion thinks for a moment. He says, let me put it this way. In the last 2,000 years, since the destruction of the Second Temple, when has the Jewish people had such good odds to regain the land of Israel? Now you might say, was it a gamble? But if we understand that this is 3 years after the Shoah, I think Ben Gurion understood that the only safeguard against another Holocaust is the state of Israel. And therefore he thought the chance was worth taking. And it was not easy. It was 6,000 people lost in the war. It was 18,000, about 12,000 injured. It was a high price to pay for a tiny Jewish presence at the time of over 600,000 people. But Ben Gurion thought this is the only way, and sometimes in history, you have to know which path to walk down. But I think there's a second part to the understanding of the state of Israel too, and the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. And this I also want to tell in the way of a story. It was probably the late 1980s, and I was just a young man out of high school, not long out of high school, and I was sent to give a talk through the Jewish Agency to young people studying in the Opan who had just made Aliyah. And there was a young man there whose name was Marcelo from Argentina, a Jewish man from Argentina. And we started talking a little bit. His English was quite good. And he told me that he had fought in the Battle of the Malvinas, the Falkland Islands. You remember that was 1982, while Israel was fighting in Lebanon. So Margaret Thatcher sent her Armada, I don't know what else to call it, their ships to the Falklands, where there had been, which officially belonged to Britain, even though the people in the Falkland Islands were not granted a British passport. And the Argentinians called it Malvinas, and the Argentinians said, no, it belongs to us. And so he said during that time he was in the tank corps in Argentina. He was in the army, in conscription. Says, of course, there was no tank corps in the Malvinas, but he was sent. He said the army was so badly equipped in the Argentinian army. He says a lot of the rifles didn't work well. he says they just weren't prepared. I guess they didn't occur to them that the British would do such a thing. He said, in the last day of the war, when the war was supposed to be over, so there was a grab on each side to take as many prisoners as possible in order to have negotiations to give a stronger position of negotiating. And said he and a friend of his, both of them were Jewish, were starting in a house in the Falklands, and that was their shelter during the time. And all of a sudden, the door opens up, and a British soldier walks in with a machine gun, points it directly at them, and says, "You guys are coming with me." They look at the British soldier, and they notice that he has a Magen David hanging around his neck. So Marcelo turns to him and says, "I don't know if you know this, but we're Jews. And I'm looking at you and you're Jews. You're a Jew too. We don't have to fight. This is not really our war." The British soldier looks at him and says, "Excuse me, I'm a British soldier. You're Argentinian soldiers. We're in the middle of a war. What you just said is irrelevant. You're coming with me." So Marcelo's friend pulls out a pistol from behind his back, shoots the British soldier. That's the story of the Jew in the Galut, in the diaspora. Sometimes we get caught up in other people's battles because we do show allegiance and patriotism to the countries that we live in. And on the occasion, we get stuck. The Israel Defense Forces is a defense army. It's an army that was built to defend the Jews living in Israel. And as we know, as in all democracies and peace-loving countries, the armies are there for defense, not for offense. When many years ago in Montreal, I was a man in my 20s at the time, and I walked into, on St. Lawrence Street, we used to have shops, electric shops. They would sell cameras and recording machines, and a lot of the shops were run by Indian Sikhs who at that time just come to Canada. And I went to buy something there. I can't remember what it was at the time. And I see the fellow, with his turban, and he has a dagger. In those times, they were still wearing daggers. I said to him, "Why are you wearing a dagger?" He says, "Because I'm a man of peace." Now, I thought he was trying to make a paradox, so I didn't really understand at the time what he meant. But years later, I said to myself, you know what? If a person is really the person of peace, the man of peace, it's better that they have the dagger than the criminal. And in general, I think that we'd all agree that it's better that the democratic and the peace-loving countries are the ones that have the better equipment, the better military, than the various dictators who want to take over the world. Sometimes, when you're living in an area which Henry Kissinger called, he said Israel is a lovely country in a difficult neighborhood, you need an army. It's not an ideal, but it's real, and it's a realism. And I think as Israelis, we all learned that from a young age, because I've been in Israel since a very young age, since the age of 15. And at the time already I had what I would call my education of what it means to be an Israeli. When I was in high school, finishing high school in Israel, there was a young man, just a year older than me. His name was Yair Landau, an American who had made Aliyah to Israel by himself. And after finishing the high school, he was conscripted into the Israeli army like every other Israeli. And he fought in Lebanon and lost his life in a tank battle there. Had another friend. His name was Chaim, an Israeli from the name Chaim Dobkin. And Chaim was actually, after high school, he did not spend time with the yeshiva, but he liked the yeshiva. And he spent months there before going to the army. He wanted to study Torah. And then he went to the army full time. But he used to come back every possibility. If he had a weekend off, he would always think, should I go home or should I go to the yeshiva? Because I want to hear what they're saying. And this was so we saw him very often at the yeshiva. He would come and spend Shabbatot. And I remember one time the Lebanon war had broken out, and Chaim came for that weekend. And he was already positioned in Lebanon. I remember him having a discussion with one of the rabbis in the yeshiva on Saturday night. He said, I'm going back, but I want you to explain something because I heard you talking about the laws of Mesirut Nefesh, of martyrdom, and I want to understand them. They had this little discussion. I don't know what they talked about. But I remember at that time I had transferred to another yeshiva in Jerusalem. And Monday morning, somebody left a newspaper in the room. On the back of the newspaper, on the obituary, I saw Chaim's name. Then I had another friend, and his name is Tzvi Glatt. Tzvi is an American. He was not an Israeli citizen, did not have to go to the army at the time. But he loved Israel, and he went to the cave of Machpelah for the weekend because he wanted to be near Hebron and the tomb of the patriarchs. And that Friday night, on the way to the synagogue, he was gunned down by some terrorists who vanished in the middle of the night. It's a difficult education in that sense, being in Israel, being a young person with aspirations and losing people that we know, young people, to a battle that was forced upon us in a neighborhood which had difficulty accepting our existence, even though we're an indigenous nation to this area. These are things that come to mind on Yom Hazikaron, on the day of memory, the memorial for the soldiers. People we've met during our lives and are not. People who gave their lives, and even the ones who were injured. People I knew and still know who went through the army, who got injured, but kept their lives going. And we all are part of this in this country. We're all part of the saga of the defense forces, survivors of terrorism, victims, the difficulties of people trying to live here, trying to create a Jewish life, which started after the darkest period in our history, when Jews again felt that the only way to create a normal society for the Jewish people is to do such in our own country. And we are a country that loves life and a country that loves peace. And because of that, together with remembering those who we have lost over these years, we always remember that the Israel Defense Forces is the only thing that stands between the Jewish people today and the possibility of another Shoah or Holocaust tomorrow. But we also are peaceful people who believe in peace, believe in democracy, and believe in the values of life that the Torah has taught us the values of life, human dignity, the human spirit, and of faith. May the memory of all those who helped us come to this day be blessed. Shalom, shalom.